Welcome to our explainer on the absolutely chaotic, brilliant, and deeply intense mind of Auguste Rodin. Today, we're exploring his greatest, yet fundamentally unfinished masterpiece, The Gates of Hell. Now, if you've ever found yourself endlessly tweaking a project, just completely unable to let it go, well, you're going to relate to this on a whole new level. Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly does a relatively mundane architectural project, literally just a pair of doors for a new museum, consume an artist's entire life? It's one of the central mysteries of the art world. We're looking at a span of almost 4 decades where these doors just haunted Rodin. They evolved from a simple government contract into the sprawling, living diary of his deepest artistic struggles. Part 1. Accepting the commission. To understand how this whole obsession began, we really have to travel back to 1880. Rodin wasn't yet the globally recognized master we know today. The French government handed him this monumental opportunity, commissioning him to design entrance doors for a proposed museum of decorative arts. Looking at these milestones, the initial delivery was set for 1885. Then the planned opening was pushed to 1895. But here's the incredible thing. The museum was never actually built. As the project dragged on without a real destination, Rodin actually returned his initial payment, which completely freed himself from any external deadlines. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Rodin originally envisioned the project in his early 1880 architectural sketch. It's highly structured, it's orderly, it's divided into neat geometric panels, really echoing traditional Renaissance portals, kind of like Lorenzo Ghiberti's famous Gates of Paradise in Florence. It's safe and, it's pretty predictable. Part 2. Entering Dante's Divine Comedy. The project shifted dramatically when Rodin faced some really harsh accusations from critics. They claimed he was literally making casts from live models, rather than actually sculpting them. So to prove his artistic integrity, he chose a subject so complex it couldn't possibly be faked: Dante's Inferno. I want you to step into Rodin's shoes for a moment and just feel the psychological weight of this. He stated, "I lived a whole year with Dante, drawing the 8 circles of his hell." Imagine being utterly consumed day in and day out by visions of eternal damnation, moral decay, and ultimate suffering. That kind of immersion, it completely changes a person. These early, moody ink and gouache sketches reveal the result of that intense immersion. It's a much darker, almost suppressed side of Rodin's personality coming to the surface. These aren't just literal illustrations of Dante's text. They're obsessive explorations of passion, rape, murder, and self-destruction. The heavy ink actually corrodes the silhouettes, creating this sense of raw agony that began to heavily influence the physical doors. Part 3. A chaotic, private playground. And this brilliantly illustrates the crucial shift where the public commission transformed into a private, obsessive labyrinth for the artist. Just think about the stark contrast here. On one hand, we've got that orderly 1880 sketch with its neat little boxes, but then you look at the final bronze cast. The traditional rules of gravity and architectural perspective simply ceased to apply. It became this continuous, churning sea of humanity where all physical boundaries are just completely obliterated. To grasp the sheer volume of this obsession, keep this number in your mind: 186. That is the number of individual figures writhing across the final surface of the composition. And get this, that doesn't even count the dozens and dozens of figures he sculpted and subsequently rejected over those decades. Rodin actually referred to this project as his Noah's Ark. Because he worked primarily in plaster during his lifetime, he could endlessly add, chop up, and layer figures. It was almost like cutting and rearranging pieces of paper. The gates weren't a static object waiting to be finished. They were a living, breathing diary of his evolving thoughts on human nature and physical form. Focus on the specific detail of these floating figures. These swirling masses of men and women are mostly anonymous, stripped of specific literary narratives or historical context. Instead, they're trapped in a state of relentless despair, unfocused energy, and ceaseless movement. They aren't just falling, they're literally floating in an abyss of eternal anxiety. Part 4. Birthing independent masterpieces. Let's move to and see how this builds. Eventually, the overarching architectural frame of the doors simply could no longer contain Rodin's rapidly expanding ideas. The gates actually became an incubator, physically spawning independent masterpieces, starting with perhaps the most famous sculpture in the entire world, the Thinker. Originally designed to sit centrally right above the doors, meant to represent Dante looking down on his creation, it was extracted from the gates entirely to become a universal symbol of thought and the heavy burden of human consciousness.
Similarly, we have the kiss. This iconic celebration of passion originally represented the doomed lovers Paolo and Francesca from Dante's Inferno and was actually placed right on the doors. But as his vision of hell grew darker, Rodin actually removed it. He felt its enclosed romantic form simply lacked the tragic, isolated suffering required for his ultimate vision of damnation. It was quite literally too beautiful for his hell.
Rodin developed this incredibly modern subtractive process. It's like an artist cutting away excess material to find a pure silhouette. He would single out specific fragments, a head, a hand, a torso, from the chaotic mass of the gates. Then he'd rework, enlarge, and exhibit these fragments as entirely new, standalone, heroic sculptures. The gates essentially provided him with an endless vocabulary of the human form.
Part 5. A heroic, unfinished work.
As we look at the reality of how this magnum opus ended, I want you to imagine walking into Rodin's studio in his later years. After 37 years of obsessive tweaking, adding, and subtracting, you wouldn't just see a neat sculpture pushed against the wall. No, the plaster forms of the gates were quite literally spilling out into the room around it. The boundaries between the artwork, the artist, and reality had completely blurred. The studio itself had become the inferno. Walking through the project's final milestones reveals a deeply tragic irony. Commissioned in 1880, displayed bizarrely in 1900, Rodin passes away in 1917. His life's work, the dark, imposing bronze gates we all recognize today, was only actually cast in bronze between 1925 and 1928. That's nearly a decade after he died. So the crucial point is the great mystery lying in his massive 1900 retrospective exhibition. The doors were shipped out, sure, but they were shown completely dismantled and bare, without the hundreds of figures attached. Why? Well, some historians say he simply ran out of time or was just too exhausted by them. But others believe Rodin felt the bare, stripped-down structure held a greater, more modern unity than the chaotic jumble of figures. Rodin's 37-year struggle with the gates of hell is the absolute ultimate story of perfectionism. It forces us to ask a deeply universal question. If a creator's vision never stops evolving, is a masterpiece ever truly finished? Or is it just eventually abandoned? Thank you for exploring this journey with us. I really hope you leave seeing Rodin and perhaps your own creative projects in a completely new light.
Knowledge grows through sharing. What are your thoughts on today's topic? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe as we continue to grow together.